Welcome and thank you for being with us tonight in the new webinar from Clever Languages. We're very happy to have you here. That being said, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Multiliteracy for Beginners, using authentic text in the introductory classroom. And we're very glad to have here Amy Lynette Clay. I'd love to introduce her. She is a teaching assistant professor and the director of French Basic Language at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's from Université de Caen-Basse-Normandie. With research interests in applied linguistics, her work focuses on second language learning and teaching, metalinguistic knowledge, grammar teaching beliefs and practices, literacy, multiliteracies, and pedagogical practices, as well as language teaching and professional development. Amy also serves as a teaching assistant professor in French and Italian and is affiliated with the European Union Center. She has published extensively, including recent work on multiliteracies pedagogy in beginning world language instruction. And we would also want to highlight her participation in Honing Our Craft, our didactic material. We're very happy to have you here, Amy. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to talk to you about literacies today, and you're going to hear me say multiliteracies and literacies, and I'm going to use them interchangeably, as a lot of people do in our field. And we're going to talk about multiliteracies for beginners, and beginners meaning our beginning language students, but also for us, any of us who might feel like we're novices or beginners with multiliteracies as the pedagogical approach, or novices with using authentic text in the language classroom. So what I'm going to do is talk to you about multiliteracies both as a framework and as an approach. So a framework for thinking about what it is that our students are learning, what teaching is, sort of conceptualizing multiliteracies, and then as an approach, meaning that I'm going to be talking about the kinds of things that we actually do in the classrooms with our students. Let's see, I will introduce a little bit about authentic text. I think this is one of the trickier pieces of literacies pedagogy and the things that we do as language teachers, and give you a sample pedagogical sequence with an example, or if we have time, maybe two. Before we get started, I see everyone in the chat sharing where you're joining from, and I would love it if you could drop in the chat what level you teach. Are you teaching high school? Are you teaching college? Are you teaching beginners, maybe second or third year students, more advanced students? And then one more piece. So what level do you teach? What language do you teach? And how do you feel you are with multiliteracies as a framework? Are you a complete novice? Are you intermediate, advanced? Have you done quite a bit of it? I'd like to hear who's here. We can see in the chat. So, and I see you have some people from Illinois too joining. Hello, fellow Illinoisans. 6th, 7th, 8th grade Spanish. I see lots of Spanish, German, French. A couple of people doing language teaching in the college setting. Awesome. Great. So we have quite a variety of folks here, lots of different languages represented. As you already know, I'm teaching French primarily. I also teach methods courses and courses on literacies in the college setting. And so you might see more examples from I'm going to bring in examples actually from a high school targeted textbook from Clet, Reporter Francophone, talk a little bit about my experiences overseeing our 1st through 4th semester classes too, where we do literacies in the classes that have slowly been adopting a more and more literacies oriented approach. All right. So let's start just with contextualizing what multiliteracies is. So I've already said it's a framework and an approach. It centers authentic texts as resources for language learning. So authentic texts are the primary resource for language learning. And what that does is that builds language content and language culture integration. And we can't get away from content when we're using authentic materials, but we also can't get away from how they're culturally embedded learning resources. And so we can use literacies then to harness all of those extra pieces that come along with the text that we're using in our classes. And I believe that literacies integrates very well with proficiency-oriented and communicative language teaching that might be familiar to you. I think that those might fit inside of a bubble of that framework, and that literacies adds on to it and gives us tools that we can use to really center those texts and engage with the content and cultural information and the textual genres that we work with. And when we talk about multi and multiliteracies, we talk about multiple meanings and multiple modalities. Multiple meanings in the sense that we all have different ways of interpreting the same things and encoding the same ideas. And I'm going to get into that more a little bit in the next slide, and multimodality in a few slides later. And I will have a nice collection of readings for you that we go along with at the end, and they'll pop up throughout. All right, so literacy is key to the literacies or multiliteracies framework. What I would like to start off with, though, is to ask you, what do you think about when you think about literacies? I'm going to bring up a Menti slide. I would like for you to share 2 or 3 words or expressions that you would use to define literacy. And then we're going to see them as you're sharing pop up on the screen here. So as you're thinking about your language classrooms and building literacy in them, what comes to mind as what literacy means for you? Getting some responses here: understanding, reading, writing, knowledge building, co-construction, genre-based. Comprehension at a deeper level. And I see kinds of texts like novels and comics. It's cognitive, engaging with the text. Mhm. Nice. Yeah. And we see in the middle some of these shared responses: comprehension, reading, writing, the cultural context. These are all going to be key to building literacy with our students. Over here, proficiency. All right. And so keep this in mind as we shift over to look at, this is the definition that you're most often going to see of literacy when you're engaging with literacy in world language education. It's from Rick Kern's 2000 book, first chapter, Notions of Literacy. It says literacy is, and this is going to match what some of you have shared, socially, historically, and culturally situated practices of creating and interpreting meaning through texts. So contextualized, creating and interpreting meaning. I saw some comprehension there through text. It entails at least a tacit awareness of the relationship between textual conventions and their context of use. And we saw genre-based, and this is where genre comes in textual conventions. And ideally, the ability to reflect critically on those relationships. Because it's purpose sensitive, literacy is dynamic and not static, and variable across and with discourse, communities, and cultures. Okay, so the way that we interpret and understand, and that the skill of literacy can change and be culturally dependent. And it draws on a wide range of cognitive abilities, a knowledge of written and spoken language, and knowledge of genres and cultural knowledge. So all of these pieces pulled together as literacy. This is kind of heavy, I think, so let's unpack it with an example. And I'm going to give you an example. This is from Reporter Francophone, one of the Klet's books. And this is an advertisement for couscous. Dari is the brand. I think we can pick that out. Savourez le meilleur, savor, enjoy the best of couscous. And it's #1 in Morocco. All right. So with this text here, we can think about cultural knowledge as being integral to literacy. So the way that we engage with this is culture dependent. Knowing that this is #1 in Morocco may mean something different to different people. For example, it may mean something different to me because I know that couscous is a staple food in Morocco, and also a food that is commonly consumed in France, for example. And so I might think about that as I'm interpreting this text because I have that cultural knowledge that maybe my students don't have. It involves creating and interpreting meaning. So somebody has created this advertisement, probably a group of people, right? With a goal of selling me or this couscous or getting me to recognize it in stores. And I'm interpreting what this means and in a totally different context too. And so I'm interpreting it not as a target audience of this, but as a language teacher deciding how to use it. And so we can think about that in terms of literacy. Advertisements, print as advertisements like this have textual conventions. They're going to have pictures of the product, some kind of tagline, usually a name, a brand name. What else do we have? Critical reflection. Critical reflection is involved in creating this text, trying to decide how do I get my target audience? How do I do what I want to with it? And it might be involved in how I read the text as a learner too, and thinking about whether or not it's meeting its goals and why. We talked about different interpretations that different people have depending on how they're interacting with the text. And of course, there's language use involved. And so this is the image, not this particular image, but this is the overarching idea of what literacy means. We're talking about literacies and literacies pedagogy. All right, so if literacy is combined or multiliteracy is combined with multimodality. I have another text here. This one says, eat well, live well at the top up here. Savor a variety of foods, healthy foods every day. And this is like a health guide from the Canadian Health Ministry. And I want to use it just to illustrate multimodality. So meanings conveyed through multiple modalities. This is probably a familiar concept for most of us. So I'm going to go through it quickly. Modalities include text and language, imagery, sound, physical, like gestural, spatial, or organization on the page, and tactile modalities. This one you can't really touch on your screen, but if you think about tactile, you might think about like the experience of scrolling or swiping and how those are different. This image here, we have information conveyed, meaning conveyed through words on the page, but also through like how this image is split up and organized into pieces and how these are next to different pieces, these chunks of text are next to different pieces of the image. And so this is using multiple ways of conveying the meaning, both through words, images. There's no sound here, but if you have video text, you would have sound. And you might have different, if this were the cover, say, of a guide, there might be like tactile things, like a glossy touch to a guide conveys something different about the meaning or the source than like a soft, like newspapery, like tactile experience too. All right. Excuse me. So we have literacies or multiliteracies and multiple ways of understanding that are culturally embedded. We have multimodality together. And when we're thinking about this in the overarching framework, the objectives are what connect what we think about as what our students are learning to what actually happens in our classroom. Multiliteracies objectives integrate linguistic, cultural, content, and textual components. Okay, so here I have what I think is a nice communicative language objective to start with. Students will be able to use adjectives and present tense in French to complete a biographical statement for profile on a language exchange website. This might align with something you've done in class before. A nice beginning lesson. If we want to try out literacies and use literacies to frame the objectives that we have for our students, we're going to adjust it slightly. Students will identify common elements of biographical statements for profile, evaluate what information is most convincing or useful in securing a language exchange partner, and use that information to complete their own biographical statement using familiar language structures and new structures or vocabulary found in the example, or by using the present tense and adjective agreement in French, for example, right? And so here what we've done is we have linguistic objectives, but we have a cultural objective. What's appropriate for this context? What kind of content should be included? We have critical reflection. What is useful? In to be included in this, and then how should I organize my information using that textual model that I have that is required, I think, if I have this kind of objective. All right, so if we shift from the framework to the approach, now we focus on the knowledge processes and pedagogical acts as the things that we do in class. And so this might be, if you've done a little bit with literacies, familiar to you. These are the 4 pedagogical acts and knowledge processes. Um, if you're reading about multiliteracies, you're going to see these interchange: situated practice and experiencing, transform practice and applying, critical framing, analyzing, over instruction, conceptualizing. Okay. I'm going to break them all down, but before I do that, what I want to share with you is that these are, when we use these and plan for them in classes, we do them in any order that's appropriate, right? And so we might start with critical framing and move to over instruction. For some kinds of lessons, we might start with situated practice and move to critical framing. Transform practice tends to be used as an assessment tool quite often. It's where students are producing things more. And over instruction tends to find its way somewhere in the middle where we're adding new information in. All right, so situated practice or experiencing. So what's happening with students here is that they're experiencing the new and the known. Experiencing the known is where they share things like their personal perspectives, experiences, or knowledge. So what do they already know, have experienced? Experiencing the new is where they identify or use information, usually from a text, that's easy to identify and doesn't involve any instructor interventions. Something that they're able to do without support, typically. Able to understand without support. Examples of that with this text that we've seen might be, what kinds of foods do you like to eat? Brainstorm and list, and then compare. Do you see them on this page? What are foods that you see on this page that are on your list or not? It can include marking up the text, like, can you find all of the, I don't know, I have a linguistic focus too. Can you find all of the verbs on this text and just highlight what looks different to you for now so we can talk about it? In a text, not this one in particular, but in a text that has some kind of chronological nature, we might do reordering or organizing information from the text. And we might have some short answer, multiple choice questions to look at clear details. I might ask students, I don't know what else with this text. What do they already know the names for that they see here? Can they identify what country this is from? Some things that they can engage with immediately before engaging with less familiar things. All right, overt instruction or conceptualizing is another piece of our pie. Okay, And this is the piece where students learn new information or skills, and those might be linguistic, textual, cultural, historic facts, things like that. And we conceptualize by classifying. So this is noticing, naming, listing, categorizing. We also conceptualize with theory. So we might identify the form or function of a linguistic feature. We might look at a text and engage with the conventions and try to use the text that we have in front of us to make generalizations about the genre or textual features or common textual features in that genre. If we're looking back to our guide page here, I mentioned earlier, oh, can you find all of the verbs? Now we might categorize them and start to name what they're doing. Why is this infinitive form in the title? And then all of the other ones are in an imperative form. We might engage with register. So here we see either formal or plural, and we might engage with why is that in this kind of guide. Um, we might identify or learn something new again, right? New information about the sociocultural context of the text, and this might help us later as we do other kinds of critical thinking tasks. Okay, so we can use this to build off of. In an overt instruction phase of teaching, if I'm asking students to focus on these verb forms, then I might incorporate some practice with them too. And that's when I'm going to draw on some of the skills that I have from communicative language teaching to build things that they could do in this context. All right. Third piece of the pie, critical framing or analyzing. And we do analyzing functionally, meaning making inferences, drawing conclusions with the text, and analyzing critically. And here is where we're evaluating and comparing. So we might evaluate practices and perspectives. We might evaluate conventions, like does this text follow the conventions and is that helping it to achieve its goal or not? We might compare practices and perspectives, like does this text, I'll give you an example here. What kind of cultural practices does this text convey to us? And are those similar to our own? And do we think that they're representative or not of what maybe like what people typically eat in a place? Um, we might also make connections across modalities. So identifying how, so, and this is where we're starting to get into that genre piece, like how do all the pieces of this text fit together and how do they impact meaning? What happens if I take part of it away? Does it still convey meaning in the same way or with the same convey the same meaning? With some texts, we might infer political or social information. I think um, this text might convey some social information to us about like with the specific like kinds of foods that are there, and I might get my students to engage with that. Um, Evaluate how effectively a text meets its goal. If we have longer chunks of text, we might ask students to identify topic sentences when we're doing critical framing. We might give them options. So when we're talking about beginners, right? And so let's say we have sections, we might give them some sample section titles and ask them to connect them to different sections of the text and say why they've done that. All I think critical framing tends to be the scariest part of literacy's pedagogy, but it comes with a lot of scaffolding. It's work on the side of the person who's developing the lesson, of course, to provide enough frame for the students to use, especially when we're focusing on using more target language in our classroom. Um, but you can do it, I'm sure, because we do it quite a bit. Transform practice. This is our fourth piece of the pie. And transform practice is the applying piece. This we can call remixing, and it's where we use new and existing knowledge or skills together. We talk about applying appropriately, so following conventions, reusing information, and we talk about applying creatively, and that's innovating with meaning or genre. Okay. Um, Let me see. There we go. So some things that we might do in a transformed practice or applying phase are emulating the genre, retelling from the perspective of a different character if we're working with a narrative format, visually representing text or textually representing visuals, or maybe responding as if you were the intended audience. I might ask my students, um, in critical framing to think about the audience of this text. And if the audience is, I don't know, they're like friends, does this text speak to them and why or why not? And then in a transformed practice activity, I might ask them to revise this text so that it speaks to, I don't know, teenagers in our school district, or so that it speaks to students on the U of I campus here, or so that it uses images of foods that are offered in the dining halls that we have, or maybe images of foods that like uh, that they eat in their homes. Um, Maybe emulating the genre. What else could we do with this? We could ask them to remake this, but to turn it into advice for somebody who is vegan or vegetarian, or somebody who has some kind of like limitation, and so to remove some things from it, to change like the wording, and to give advice like based on, or to give advice based on this. Another thing I really love to do with short text like this, and in engaging kind of as the intended audience, is what would you say if you were sharing this on social media? What would be like the tag that you share with it, or come up with a hashtag for it, as if you're going to share it. All right. Before I go on to give you, oh, sorry. Let me just bring us back together one for a second. So we have the pedagogical acts and knowledge processes here. And again, so we're going out of order with these. And the next thing I'm going to do is give you an option for how to integrate these into a pedagogical sequence. But before we do that, I want to go back to our Mentimeter. Right. So we talked about critical framing, analyzing, overt instruction or conceptualizing, situated practice and experiencing, and transform practice and applying. What do you think is the most difficult for your students to do, or will be the most difficult when you try out a literacies lesson with them, if you haven't before? And you can join using the QR code, and then there's a code also at the top of the screen. So most difficult gets first, least difficult gets fourth. What do you think is the most difficult for your students? Yeah. So it seems like critical framing and transformed practice are harder, with critical framing standing out a little bit compared. And yeah, and I see also in the chat some folks saying critical framing as well. And so building that like analyzing skill and getting them to do critical thinking in their second or other languages, it's pretty tough. And this I would say aligns to probably with a lot of what the research is showing about this. All right, so next question is, what do you do in your classes? Okay, so you probably do a little of all of these, maybe not within a literacies framework, but if you have 100% of the time that you spend doing teaching type tasks, how would you divide that up? And so we're still on the Menti, and we're gonna highlight how do we divide our class time with our students? Do we spend it analyzing, conceptualizing, experiencing, or applying? What do we spend the most time with our students doing? I know I probably spend the most time doing situated practice or experiencing with my students, like asking them, what do they already do? What do they know? What do they think about X topic? Who's their family? Like all of these things that they where they're sharing their own information in the target language. Yeah, and overt instruction or conceptualizing, so focusing on like learning something new to add to their repertoires too. And we see here, as we're filling this out, that we probably spend the least time on analyzing. And I just want to highlight for us, if I go back a slide, if I can go back a slide, there we go, that we think that's the hardest for our students. And I'm going to say I think that's the hardest for us as teachers too, to integrate into our lessons. And so there's some connections that we might be able to build here in um, in the things that we focus our time on. And if we're doing literacies pedagogy, they don't need to be balanced. In my opinion, I don't think there's anyone who says that they do. Um, but we can't miss out on that critical framing piece where we're teaching our students to evaluate texts for their effectiveness and to think about the cultural perspectives that are presented in them. Um, and it's really hard for our students to do, and we tend to shy away from it as teachers and maybe not spend quite as much time building that skill in our classrooms. So I think this is where literacies comes in and gives us tools to do it. So I want to talk about those tools in the context of an example, but first I want to talk about authentic texts. And let me check time. Okay, so with authentic texts, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what they are first, and then how we can find good authentic texts that we can use with our beginning level students. All right, so two main things with authentic texts is that their target audience is users of the target language, and they're not created for the purpose of language teaching. Think of that. This is the litmus test for, am I using an authentic text or not? Is it socially and culturally situated? Is it meaningful and purposeful? Um, yes, because it's being used for purpose in the real world, right? Um, and so um, let's do a little test. And here, I won't say thumbs up, thumbs down, but we can continue to use the chat. Is the text authentic or pedagogical? So let's test ourselves with this first one. We've seen this already today, the eat well, live well. Is this authentic or pedagogical? Is the target audience users of the target language authentic? Is the target audience our students? Is it made for students pedagogical? Yeah, I see authentic everywhere. All right, let's keep going. We've seen this today, this advertisement for Dari Couscous. Authentic or pedagogical? Authentic. Yeah, the target audience is users of the target language. It has a purpose related to that. That's not for teaching world languages or teaching French in this case. All right, here's another one. This is a YouTube video. It says, talk to me about yourself, 3 responses for interviews, and it's targeting responses for job interviews. Is this one authentic or pedagogical? And so if we think about who's the target audience of this text, is it world language students, the students that we're teaching in our classrooms? I would consider this text authentic because it's culturally situated. It's telling us something about, in the context where it's created, what people expect to see in interviews. It's not targeting our students in our own cultural context. So I would go with authentic for this one, personally. Yeah, somebody says it depends. Stacy Reynolds says it depends on if it was created for learners in a context of getting a job. So was it created for maybe world language learners who are trying to get a job in French? then maybe that would make it pedagogical. And this particular one has a pedagogical goal, but when we're talking about language teaching, it's authentic in that it is targeting speakers of French who are looking for jobs. And I think this is in the context of France. I should have kept the tag so that you could see the who created it. All right, here's another one. This says oral comprehension A2, presidential elections. And it's a text that has images that pop up and it talks to us. It tells us all about the presidential election processes in France. So is this one authentic or pedagogical? And here we're going to ask ourselves, who is the target audience? The target audience of this text is students. It's an oral comprehension activity. It's Yeah, and Saba Khan here says pedagogical tout en français makes language learner videos and activities. Yep, exactly. So the target audience for this text is world language students, right? So students who are learning French. The language is adjusted to them. It's rich in cultural information. So don't throw it out. It's great, but it is a pedagogical text. And so you're going to approach it differently than how you approach an authentic text that is created in a cultural and historical context where we can, analyze it for information about whether or not it's meeting its target audience, things like that. So let's do one more. This is in Reporter francophone, and it says, so that's the textbook that we mentioned earlier. It says the typical school day, or sorry, a typical day for school kids according to the country, and it's authored by Statista, which is the European Statistics Agency. See a few pedagogical and authentic. I'm going to show you the original source for this, and maybe that's going to help us too. Let me bring it up over here quickly. Okay, so this is Statista, it's a European Statistics Agency, and this is that original source for that text, and it's in the textbook. Yeah, so this one is pretty solidly like an authentic text. It looks like it's been slightly adjusted, though, if we go back here. Sorry, I gotta come back. Got a few to go through. The topics here are slightly adjusted. It says cours instead of class. But this would be authentic in nature. So if we're using the definition of target audience, this is to convey information in French to speakers of French, not to teach students language, right? So this one would be authentic. It is slightly adapted, and I really love going to the original source because as a teacher, I can see the context of it and more information maybe about the statistics that were done with it. If you search for this, you can find it too if you're teaching with this book. But this I would call authentic. Let's do one more. This one says arts at the top. Sorry, Josh and Ava do theater, Katie does drawing, Amelia does dance. Yeah, so this one's a pedagogical text. It gives some examples maybe of the form that we want students to use. I think this would be a nice example, like if we're doing a transform practice activity where we're building a poster based on something else, like an authentic text we've used. But it seems to be focused on learning the verb faire, exactly, or to do in French, right? So this would be pedagogical. And here's one more. This is the magazine des reporters. It's in also the Reporter francophone textbook. It's written by maybe Mirsa, who's in Martinique, France, for the textbook for the students. Yeah. So I see a few people dropping in pedagogical for this one in the chat. Yeah, and this one's pedagogical. It presents, sorry, a few different athletes. Um, but the target audience is students. The language is adjusted for students to be able to understand it. Um, and something I will point out that's super nice about this text, and that we don't actually find with a lot of pedagogical texts that do bios for people, is it actually follows the conventions of biographies in French, which is to use the historic present instead of past, and it's using present tense. Um, that's one of the the things that stick out to me quite often is when we have pedagogical texts in our books and materials that use language in a way that's adjusted for students, but also maybe they don't convey to our students the ways that language is used by speakers of French around the world, right? All right, so this last one was pedagogical. Um, and some of the values I think that we get from pedagogical texts are, again, I want to say the cultural content, the ability to engage with genre, and that's what literacies is bringing in. I'm not saying, I want to be very clear, throw out pedagogical texts, only use authentic ones, but I am saying when we're doing literacies and trying out literacies, prioritizing authentic texts so that we can talk about all of those pieces that are involved is a good practice. All right, so let's say we want to use authentic text for beginners. We've had a few good examples of texts that follow some of these recommendations. So use texts that are multimodal, convey information in multiple ways. Use texts that have words, lists, single sentences. So in the text that we've seen, very few of them had more than a sentence as a string together, because our beginners are novice and they can't engage with long chunks of text yet. And so we want to pick texts that naturally do that. And we don't have to create them. We see, there's charts and graphs, there's infographics, there's cover pages that we've seen, there's advertisements. So there's a wealth of these kinds of texts available to us. Pick ones that have graphics and images. And then this is very important. If you want to save yourself hassle, pick text where the images, content, and meaning together align. So choosing things where maybe there's sarcasm or there's an image that's distracting, or maybe the image is trying to convey the opposite meaning of what the words say. This isn't going to work great for beginners because they don't have the language skills and the experience with engaging with these kinds of texts to be able to figure out what the actual meaning is. And let's say you do choose to use something where there's misalignment between the pieces of the text. Be prepared by scaffolding more and drawing your students' attention to those things. Use familiar genres or familiar information. And this is my last recommendation for authentic text. And that's when we're picking authentic text. If we want to try with our beginning learners to take only one step away from what they know. And so pick a genre that's familiar when you're working with information that's really unfamiliar, that is hard to understand, or work with information that's familiar when you're working with genres that are a little more distant from what they're used to working with. All right, so where do we find these authentic texts? One, textbooks. There are reading and viewing lessons in a lot of textbooks. In Reporter Francophone, there is, in the teacher's guide, this little authentic resource box that will give you some ideas of resources that you can use, sometimes links to them and ideas about like their history. This is just one example that's in there. Also in our textbooks, we can look at the pedagogical texts that are there and find authentic versions. An example, like with biographies, is that we might identify like a biography that's a nice topic, but maybe that's not, maybe we want to do literacies with that lesson and focus on like what are the pieces of a biography and how are they typically written and what are the um, maybe comparing a couple that to identify what's more effective. Then we want to go and look for some authentic versions, ideally. Another thing you can do is brainstorm common contexts for whatever your target topics are, and that might be, you might be working with a grammar-driven syllabus. I certainly am in a couple of classes that I teach. And there I might be thinking about, okay, so I want to work on this grammatical function. What are the kinds of texts where it's typically found? And so that's going to help me to do better searches when I'm looking for these. Another thing is saved collections. So I personally am old and I use Facebook a lot. And I save things constantly, though, things that I want to use in my classes. And then I can go back and look through later when I'm actually like doing work. And then the last piece here is social media teaching communities. So for our last about 10 minutes here, I want to talk about developing beginner level literacies lessons. And I'm going to give you a sample pedagogical sequence here. Um, and with 7 steps, with a short text, I think you can do this in a 1 hour lesson. Maybe you want to, if you have either a little bit of homework or a little bit of pre-work, or in maybe a 2-day or 2 hour lesson if that fits your schedule better. Oh, and before I talk about this, I'm seeing a couple more in the chat. One is that you can request a copy of Reporter Francophone if you want to see materials there. So sample pedagogical sequence. And these here are going to be referencing situated practice experiencing, critical framing, overt instruction, and transformed practice. So just put those in parentheses so you know what fits best in these spots. The first 3 are going to be familiar to you. Pre-reading, previewing. Identify and reflect on what you already know and believe. So identify, experiencing, and reflect on it. Does that mean that I'm going to be biased in how I interact with this text? What are, I don't know, as an example of critical framing, or how strongly do I believe that, things like that. How does what I believe compare to what other people in the class believe, etc. Initial textual interaction. So here's that part where we interpret easy parts of the text. Like we read the title and learn something from the title. Maybe we look at images on the text. And then after that, so that initial textual interaction, sorry, step 2, that's our sort of first like dipping our toes in the text to kind of feel like we can get a sense of what's going on before we jump in to really focus on meaning. And here we're going to identify main ideas, details, and reflect critically on them. And that critical reflection might be reflecting on the perspectives conveyed in the text, authorship. It might be also thinking about or being able to identify main ideas or things that are not main ideas. If I'm doing this with beginners, again, I'm going to give them options to pick from using familiar language, but so that they can use the target language to do those things. All right, so moving on from here, we're going to move to linguistic focus. And here is where we identify and practice with grammar, vocab, register, or other linguistic features that the text, that are demonstrated in the text. After that, textual analysis. And this is, I want to say key to literacy, and it's a transferable skill. So learning how to analyze a text for the kind of genre it is and reuse that genre or evaluate how well it fits the genre is something that we do every day. And so here we're recognizing and evaluating textual conventions. This tends to be conceptualizing and analyzing. And then typically at the end is the time that I do remixing and writing or creating. So I take what I know, I take what I learned, and I bring them together in some way to make something new, a new text conveying something new. And lastly, self-reflection. Um, and that might be reflecting on my process of writing, creating, my own as a learner, my process of engaging with the text, things that I feel like I need to learn or want to know more about. Depends on you as a teacher and what you want to focus student self-reflection. Let's try this with a text that we can use for beginners. So I have a QR code here for you and a short link. So you can use bit.ly/ and you have to use capitals here, auth text 2. And that's just going to take you to this text so that you can see it in context. Me. All right, and so this text here, it says École des Petits Romains on top, so it's the name of the school. It's a school, I think, in Poitiers, but I'm not sure. I'd have to double check. And it's a list of school supplies for CM1 and CM2 students. So these are elementary students. I'm going to do pre-reading. So one, this is great for us when we're teaching those early units. Like we use a textbook, some of the early units are school supplies and classroom oriented. Maybe we'll want to use the target language when we're talking to our students to say, like, take out your pens or use a red pen to do this or whatever it is. So this is a really nice way to start off. Oops, sorry. So that's a list of, let me go back, of school supplies. So pre-reading, before the students even look at this, I'm going to ask them if they can, maybe I'm going to give them a sheet of paper or something where they can circle all the school supplies that they think are the most important to bring to class, or maybe that will rank them, something like that. But we're going to start engaging with the topic of the text. And if I'm using images, I'm going to put words with it, and that's going to be a little bit of experiencing and then a little bit of overt instruction. So I'm getting the language that I want them to learn in there early. Okay. Initial textual interactions. Here, when I teach this, I actually use this with our first semester students here at U of I. And when I teach this, I ask the students to look up CM1 and CM2. Just go find out, like, what age is that, what students are there. And then I might also ask them to look at the title and tell me what are like 3 or 4 words in the title that tell them the most about what's in this text. Okay, so just a little like dipping our toes in, getting a sense of what's coming. Okay, and then when I focus on meaning, we might go over here. This is a list of all the things that you put in your pencil case. So there's 5 blue pens and 3 red pens and 3 green pens and a black pen and 3 pencils, an eraser, all of these things. So I might do something like how many different, I would ask in English, but they have to engage with the French here to do it. How many different writing utensils do they have to have? Add them all up and show me how did they get their number. Okay, so I'm getting them to think about familiar words like stylo, and see it in a bunch of different contexts. Maybe we're going to do a little bit of overt instruction so we make sure we can build vocabulary here to figure out which ones are highlighters, things like that. What else do I do when I focus on meaning? I might point out some of the cultural things in here. So in the US, when we use rulers, we tend to do inches. And so I might ask them to find the how to say ruler in French. by finding the 30 centimetres here. There's a few more things on this that are interesting, that I'm gonna actually bring that up. Something interesting in France is that people tend to capitalize their last name, and maybe I want to point that out for my students or ask them to identify like what parts of names in this text are capitalized. Have you seen that anywhere else? I'm going to have these side by side for now so you can see a little better. Linguistic focus. So when I teach this, my linguistic focus tends to be building vocabulary for classroom objects, but maybe I want to ask my students to look for all of the adjectives and start to identify like which adjectives are masculine or feminine, or how do we do plural on things. Textual analysis. What I do with my students is I look at how the list is marked. So it uses asterisks, and the difference between that and these little arrows and what that indicates to the reader. And I ask them, do they think that's an effective way to do this? And would they do the same thing or would they do something else? I personally don't think it's the most effective way to do it. And so I like to get my students to engage with that and be critical thinkers about the kinds of texts they engage with. And then, of course, I have them make their own list and consider the elements that are on this list, what they thought was important for their context, and what they thought were better textual conventions. And then at the end of something like this, I think I might have a can you go with daddy, please? Sorry, I have my daughter just got home with her dad from daycare, so she's coming to visit. Come on over. We'll finish here together, okay? All right. And then I asked them to reflect on what they learned, what they need to learn. You want to pick her up? Sorry. We're okay. See you later. Good timing. As we wrap up. Oh, poor girl. I'm gonna close the door. All right. So I asked them to reflect on how successful they felt like they were doing this as well. Okay, so I don't have time for the second text, but I can share more about that later. And so I'm just gonna highlight just a few quick recommendations. One, start small. So adjust familiar lessons if you want to try literacies out for the first time. Try a template first, instead of jumping around across all of the pieces of the pie, right? Do a lesson a quarter, a lesson a unit. Don't overhaul everything and keep it low stakes, no assessment related until you're feeling good about it. I like to always tell my students why. I think this is valuable for them because they build transferable skills. They get to learn to use French in context with other French speakers. And then my last piece is scaffold, especially for beginning learners. And that might be through sequencing small steps in tasks, and that might be by adding in supports like language banks or options to pick from, things like that. All right, so as promised, there will be references in the slides for you. I think there's a couple of good reads. I realized I forgot to include the chapter that has 2 new examples too from Honing Our Craft. And a really nice look at literacies, I think, in this book that came out also last year from Paisani and Menke. Thank you all for attending. I'm really happy to have been able to talk with you and hear some of your experiences in the chat and on Menti. And feel free to reach out to me. I'll stay around to ask questions, but feel free to reach out by email if you want to connect more.
So we would love to present our first Honing Our Craft conference in Canada. This is going to be a virtual event, and it's on the 20th of April. That's going to be from 9 a.m. until 1 p.m. Pacific time. And of course, we would love to see you there. Even if you're from the US, of course, you can join us. We have some amazing presenters such as Joshua Cabral, who's going to teach us about strategies and practices for an inclusive and diverse language classroom. Florencia Henshaw, who is also one of the editors of the book, and she will help us to discuss strategies for using technology with the students, how to facilitate global cultural exchange and language acquisition. And we have Diego Ojeda, who many of you may know, and with him we will explore methods and materials for reading comprehension and fluency amongst learners, among many other interesting things. As I mentioned, if you're from the US, you can still join us. We will love to see you there. If you just want to register, it would be $29.95. And there is a special offer in case you buy a copy of Hone in Our Craft. With the registration, it will be $49.95. We will put the link in the chat in a few seconds, which is this one, cletwl.ca, HOC 2024. Okay, so far we only have one question. So again, everyone, if you still want to put any questions, feel free to. So Amy, the question we have is basically if you could give us a bit more insight on what can we do when the teachers do not have enough time to apply all the frameworks. What would you suggest?
Yeah, so I think that that's part of what I was hoping to get at when I was saying start small. So there's no way you have time to develop brand new materials where you supplement everything for every single lesson that you teach, right? And so one, borrow. I'm happy to share anything that I've done before, and I think that is true of a lot of teachers. And two, start small. Take something from the textbook that you're using, and it must have an authentic text or some kind of text where you can find an authentic equivalent, and then work with that and try using just that simple like sample pedagogical sequence that I shared earlier, and test it out by doing one of each of those things with your text and see what happens with your students, see how it goes. What I have found is that finding the text is the hardest, if they're not already available to me in the materials that I use. But that the more I practice doing this, like any other thing that we learn how to do, I get really fast at it. And so um, coming up with what to do with the text I shared today after doing it for, well, I guess multiple years for me, longer than maybe I would like to admit. I feel like I can come up with something to do in my classes pretty fast. And so again, like I'm happy to share, but then for you, if you're really limited on time, do it once a semester, once a quarter, just to start getting a sense of how to do it and what it might offer with your students.
Thank you. And yes, so far we have no additional questions. So again, Amy, thank you very much. I think we have no questions because everything was very clearly explained and it was really useful. So thank you very much. So again, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Amy, and I hope you all have an amazing evening.